This is a story from Ohio, 2006, about a taxi driver who helped an old woman get home, shared tea in her kitchen, and returned days later to a house that had been empty for years. What the police found inside proved he was telling the truth, and what followed him after still refuses to let him sleep. People assume taxi drivers remember rides by faces or destinations, but most remember them by how the night felt. And Mark Reynolds always said that night felt wrong long before he picked her up. It was February of 2006 in northern Ohio, the kind of winter where the cold presses against your chest and the streets empty early. Mark had been driving the late shift for almost 9 years, mostly Cleveland outskirts, mostly quiet runs. Hospital pickups, airport overflow, nothing unusual. He knew every shortcut, every dead zone where the radio crackled, every porch light that stayed on all night. That evening started like any other. Coffee gone cold in the cup holder, AM radio murmuring weather updates, light snow turning the asphalt dull and gray. He almost didn't stop when he saw her standing near a closed grocery store, mostly because people didn't stand outside at that hour, not in that neighborhood. Not in that weather. She was old, enough that her back curved inward, wearing a long, dark coat and holding 2 paper grocery bags against her chest. She didn't wave, she didn't look panicked. She just stood there patiently, like she knew someone would come. Mark later said that was the first detail that stuck with him, how calm she looked, like she wasn't worried about the cold or the time. When he rolled down the window, she leaned in and thanked him before he even agreed to take her somewhere. Her voice was soft but clear, not shaky like he expected, and when she gave the address, he felt a flicker of recognition, even though he was sure he'd never been there. She apologized for the bags, said her hands weren't as strong as they used to be, and asked if he minded helping her inside when they arrived. Mark said yes without thinking. It felt rude not to, like saying no would be breaking some unspoken rule. The drive itself was quiet. She didn't talk much, just commented on the snow and asked if business had been slow. He noticed her reflection in the rearview mirror more than once, how she watched the road ahead instead of him, how her eyes seemed focused but distant, like she was thinking about something far away. The radio kept losing signal as they moved farther from the main road, static rising and falling in uneven bursts, and at one point the engine stuttered for just a second before smoothing out again. Mark laughed it off and apologized, but she smiled and said, "Machines get tired too. Sometimes they just need patience." That sentence stayed with him. The house was at the end of a narrow street lined with bare trees, most homes dark except for a few dim porch lights. Hers stood back from the road, older than the others, paint faded but well kept, and one light glowing in the front window like someone had been waiting. He carried the groceries to the door while she fumbled with her keys, then paused and looked at him like she was deciding something important. She thanked him again, more sincerely this time, and asked if he would like to come in for tea because it was too cold to rush back out. He hesitated, but the house looked normal, warm even, and something about the way she asked made it hard to refuse. Inside, it smelled faintly of old wood and dried herbs, the kind of smell houses get when they've been lived in a long time. The kitchen was small but tidy, with patterned mugs already set on the counter, as if she'd planned to use them. She moved slowly but confidently, boiling water, placing the groceries into the fridge herself, each item going exactly where it belonged. They sat at the small table and talked about nothing important, the weather, the neighborhood, how things used to be quieter. She told him she'd lived there a very long time, Mark noticed there were no photographs anywhere, no calendar, no clock ticking, just the sound of the kettle settling and the hum of the refrigerator. When he finally stood to leave, she thanked him again and wrapped a knitted scarf tighter around her neck, a pale blue one that looked handmade. He didn't realize until hours later that she had left it on the back seat of his taxi, and by then, the night already felt too strange to forget. Mark didn't notice the scarf until near the end of his shift, when the sky had started to pale and the snow had thinned into a wet mist. He found it folded neatly on the back seat, as if someone had placed it there on purpose, not dropped it. The pale blue yarn was warm when he picked it up, still holding a trace of heat that made no sense after hours in an unheated car. He considered turning back immediately, but the address was far from his usual route, and daylight was already creeping in, so he told himself he'd return it the next evening. That day he slept poorly, dreaming of quiet kitchens and kettles that never quite stopped humming. When he woke, the scarf was still on the chair where he'd left it, smelling faintly of something herbal, almost medicinal. He drove back just after sunset, expecting a quick stop, a polite thank you, and maybe a smile of embarrassment for forgetting it. The street looked different in daylight fading to dark, the trees more skeletal, the houses older than he remembered, but he was sure it was the same place. He parked in front of the house and noticed immediately that the front window was dark. The porch light was off. He knocked anyway, lightly at first, then harder. Nothing. No movement, no sound. He rang the bell and waited, listening to the hollow echo from inside. The house felt empty in a way that went beyond lights being off. Mark told himself she was probably asleep or out, but something about that explanation didn't sit right. He tried again the next night, then the one after that, always at different hours, always getting the same result. He never saw another car in the driveway, never heard a television or radio inside. The scarf stayed in his car longer than it should have, because returning it had shifted from a simple errand into something that felt unfinished. He asked a dispatcher if they knew anything about the house at the end of that street, but they didn't, and one joked that half those old places were rentals that sat empty for years. Mark laughed along, but his stomach tightened. On the fourth day, he noticed something else: the mailbox. It was stuffed so full that letters were bent at the edges, flyers damp from snowmelt, none of them taken in. He stood on the porch longer than he meant to, hand on the door frame, feeling a strange pressure in his ears like the air was thicker there. That was when he decided to file a report. Not a missing person exactly, just a welfare check. He told the officer at the station about the elderly woman, the groceries, the tea, the scarf. The officer listened politely at first, then asked for the address. When Mark gave it, the room shifted in a way he couldn't explain. The officer stepped away, returned with another man, and they exchanged a look that Mark recognized from years of watching people realize something was wrong. They asked him to repeat the story from the beginning, slower this time, details included. What did she look like? How old was she? What was she wearing? What day exactly had this happened? When Mark finished, one of them told him the house had been unoccupied for years. The owner, a widow named Eleanor Whitmore, had died in 1998. No next of kin, no tenants, no recent utility usage. Mark laughed at first, said that couldn't be right because he had been inside the house less than a week ago. He described the kitchen, the mugs, the fridge, the way the light looked in the front window. The officers didn't interrupt, but when he stopped, one of them asked him to come with them to the house. He agreed, relieved in a strange way, like this would finally resolve the feeling that had been tightening around him since that night. The drive felt longer than it should have. The street was darker than before, only one streetlight working. When they approached the house, Mark felt his chest sink. The porch light was still off, but the door was unlocked. The officers entered first, flashlights cutting through dust that hung in the air like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Mark stepped inside and froze. The smell was wrong. It wasn't stale or rotten. It smelled like tea leaves and old wood. The kitchen was exactly as he remembered it. The table stood in the same place, and on it were two mugs, one chipped, one patterned, stained with a brown ring at the bottom where tea had dried. The refrigerator hummed quietly when one officer opened it, and inside were the groceries Mark had carried in days earlier: milk, vegetables, bread, still fresh, still cold. The officers stared in silence. One of them whispered that the utilities had been shut off for nearly a decade. Mark couldn't speak. He pointed to the chair where she had sat, to the counter where the kettle had been. No dust, no signs of forced entry. One officer radioed for backup while the other asked Mark to sit down because his legs had started shaking uncontrollably. It was then they showed him the photograph. A black and white image from an old case file, a woman with kind eyes and a familiar smile, wearing a pale blue knitted scarf. Mark nodded before they even asked. He said yes. That's her. That's the woman I drove home. That's the woman I had tea with. And as he said it, he realized something else that made his blood run cold. He had never told them about the scarf. After that night, Mark was no longer treated like a confused witness, but like someone standing too close to something no one wanted to name. The police sealed the house temporarily, not because they believed in ghosts, but because nothing else explained how a shut-off property could feel lived in. They told Mark to go home, rest, and not speak to anyone about what he'd seen until they figured out what kind of report this was going to become. He tried to obey, but the house stayed with him in ways he couldn't escape. When he closed his eyes, he could still hear the refrigerator hum, steady and patient, like a heartbeat that wasn't supposed to be there. He kept expecting a call from the station telling him it was all a mistake, that the utilities had been illegally reconnected or someone had been squatting inside, but the call never came. Instead, the scarf appeared again. He found it folded on the passenger seat at the start of his next shift, even though he was certain he had handed it to the officers as evidence. His log showed no fares since the previous night, but the meter read miles he couldn't account for. He drove anyway, trying to focus on the road, trying not to look at the empty back seat for too long. Passengers commented on the smell of tea without knowing why, and one asked him if he'd recently driven near an old house on Ashwood Lane, even though Mark had never said the street name out loud. That night, his radio began picking up fragments of conversations that didn't match any channel. Soft voices cutting in between dispatch calls, sometimes saying his name, sometimes just breathing. When he finally went home, the scarf was gone again, only to reappear the next morning draped over the back of his kitchen chair like it had always belonged there. He called the police. They told him to bring it back in. The officer on duty this time was younger, less patient, and he suggested stress or sleep deprivation. Mark almost believed him until he noticed condensation forming on his own kettle, even though it wasn't turned on, and the faint sound of boiling water filling the room. He stopped driving for 3 days. After that, he was summoned back to the station and shown additional records. The house had been checked thoroughly. No hidden power sources, no evidence of recent human presence beyond what Mark had described. Fingerprints lifted from the mugs matched Eleanor Whitmore's, confirmed from archived records taken after her death. They also found something else in the kitchen drawer, an old taxi receipt dated the same night Mark picked her up, printed with his cab number, but the company had no record of the fare. He told them he never printed receipts unless asked. The officers exchanged looks again, that same look from the first day, only heavier now. They asked if Eleanor had said anything unusual. Mark thought about the way she'd spoken about patience, the way she'd thanked him like she'd been waiting a long time for help. He said no, not really. That wasn't entirely true. That night, as he lay awake listening to the pipes settle in his walls, his phone rang just once. No number displayed. When he answered, there was only the soft hiss of static and a familiar, gentle voice saying, "I'm home now, thank you." And then the line went dead. Mark sat there until morning, holding the phone, knowing without doubt that something had followed him back from that house, and that returning the scarf had never been the end of the ride. The police advised Mark to stay with family for a while, as if distance could loosen whatever grip that house had taken on him. But the moment he stepped into his sister's spare room, he knew it wouldn't matter. Her house was newer, bright, full of noise. Yet at night, it grew quiet in the same unnatural way, like the world was holding its breath. He began hearing movement in the kitchen after midnight, slow, deliberate sounds, drawers opening gently, ceramic touching ceramic. When he checked, nothing was out of place, but the air smelled faintly of boiled water and dried herbs. His sister asked him why he kept leaving mugs on the counter. He hadn't. He started finding groceries he never bought inside the refrigerator, brands he remembered carrying into Eleanor's house weeks earlier, always placed neatly, never expiring. He returned to the station again, bringing photos this time, dates and timestamps clear. The officers stopped dismissing him. They told him the house on Ashwood Lane had been sold at auction 2 years after Eleanor's death, but no one ever finalized the purchase because every inspection failed for reasons no one could agree on. One inspector quit on the spot. Another claimed he heard someone moving upstairs, even though the house had no second floor. Mark was shown Eleanor's death certificate. She died alone in that same kitchen from heart failure, collapsed beside the table. She had been found days later by a neighbor who noticed the porch light still on. Mark felt sick when he heard that detail, because the night he picked her up, the porch light had been on too. He asked if anyone had checked the house since the police visit. They had. It was empty again. The mugs were gone. The groceries were gone. No smell, no warmth, no sign anyone had ever been there recently. Except for one thing. On the table lay a single knitted scarf, pale blue, fiber worn thin from use. The officers asked Mark where he'd gotten his copy. He told them he didn't have one anymore. That night his sister woke him, asking why an elderly woman had been standing in the driveway earlier, staring at the house. She described her without seeing a photograph, and every detail matched. Eleanor's eyes, her posture, the coat. She said the woman looked confused, like she was waiting for someone to open the door. Mark packed his things before sunrise. He drove until he reached a motel off the interstate and paid cash. He tried to sleep with the lights on, but the hum returned, the same steady refrigerator sound, though the room had none. The scarf lay folded at the foot of the bed when he woke, and this time, it was damp with melted snow. The strange events did not end suddenly. They thinned out the way fog does, almost unnoticed at first. Mark realized one morning that he had slept through the night without waking to the sound of movement or the hum that had followed him for months. The scarf no longer appeared folded on chairs or draped across door handles. The smell of tea faded from his apartment, then from his car, and finally from his memory until he could no longer recall exactly what it had been like. He kept waiting for her to return, for the familiar weight in the room or the soft presence behind him. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing happened. His life slowly stitched itself back together. He returned to work, took short daytime shifts, and learned how to drive again without checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. The police never contacted him again. The house on Ashwood Lane remained empty, eventually boarded up, then sold and renovated by a family who reported no unusual activity at all. Mark drove past it once, years later, and felt nothing. No pressure, no warmth, no recognition. It was just a house. People asked him about that winter sometimes, about the break he took, about the rumors he never confirmed. He learned to smile and say it was stress, that he'd needed rest, and most accepted that explanation gladly. No one wanted more. They wanted closure, and Mark understood that some stories don't offer it. He never saw Eleanor Whitmore again, never heard her voice, never found the scarf. He couldn't say when or why it ended, only that one day she was simply gone, as if whatever tether had held her in place had finally loosened. He wondered if she had needed someone to witness her one last time, to remember her as real, to carry her groceries, to sit with her at a table and treat her like she was still alive. Maybe that had been enough. Maybe being seen had allowed her to let go. Mark lived the rest of his life quietly. He avoided night driving when he could, and never accepted passengers who stood too patiently in the cold. He never forgot Ohio, 2006, or the way kindness had opened a door he hadn't known existed. He understood now that not every haunting is violent, not every presence angry. Some are simply waiting, and sometimes they choose someone not because they are special, but because they are willing. And that is the part that stayed with him the longest. Not fear, not disbelief, but the certainty that whatever walked with him that winter had done so gently, gratefully, and only for as long as it needed to. No one ever learned why Eleanor chose Mark Reynolds. That answer was never written down, never archived, never filed away. The world moved on. The house grew quiet. The story ended. But somewhere between memory and silence, one truth remained. Some encounters happen only once, leave no proof behind, and yet change everything. And those who experience them are left knowing something most people never will, that the line between the living and the dead is thinner than anyone wants to believe.